Good morning, Dan and Amy. So is President Trump getting us more involved in Syria? Is he drawing a red line in Syria? Is he going to enforce a no-fly zone, as had been previously suggested, to protect the Syrian Democratic Force, such as they are? This is the anti-Assad collection that is backed by a U.S.-led coalition, and a Navy fighter shot down a Syrian warplane that was bombing those forces yesterday, escalating the conflict, particularly drawing us into increased conflict with Iran as well. For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by our friend Colonel Cedric Leighton, who is he's a military expert and military intelligence expert who served both on the Joint Chiefs of Staff as well as to the National Security Council. He's a CNN military analyst. Cedric, thanks so much for joining us again. Appreciate it.
You bet, Dan. It's my pleasure.
So what about that? How should we interpret the engagement in the air by Navy fighter in terms of the administration's larger Syrian policy?
Well, you pose a very interesting question. Is this going to be the start of a no-fly zone? And I think what I'm seeing right now leads me to believe it may be a de facto no-fly zone without a real announcement that we, in fact, have a no-fly zone, if that makes any sense. So the basic idea would be this. The U.S. forces, like the F-A-18 Hornet that shot down a Syrian fighter, an Su-22, near Raqqa, yesterday. That kind of action is something that the Syrian Air Force and, oh, by the way, the Russians can expect as we close in on Raqqa. So it's not the kind of no-fly zone that we had set up in Iraq, both on the northern side and on the southern side before we went to war the second time in Iraq. And if this happens, you'll get the same effect without the kind of force posture that we had there, and that really does make a difference, and it can certainly be more efficient than we did in the past if it's done right.
What was the Syrian warplane doing prior to the Navy jet shooting it down?
Bombing the SDF.
So what the reports indicate, Amy, are these. That what they have said is that the Syrian fighter, which is a ground attack fighter, was engaged in attacking the Syrian Democratic Forces that were encamped in an area that was southwest of Raqqa. Basically, they were on an approach line toward Raqqa, so they were clearly engaging ISIS fighters, and the Syrian Army Air Forces were attacking those Syrian Democratic Forces on the ground.
Yeah.
So that's why the plane was shot down.
But the SDF, the Syrian Democrat Force, previously they were like the Holy Roman Empire. They're neither, which was neither holy nor Roman. They were neither democratic or much of a force. And I guess my question is this the same collection of terrorists and would-be terrorists that was previously reported? Are these this group of Syrian Defense Forces? This is an organization we'd want to install if we could in replace of Assad?
Well, that's where everybody takes a very deep breath and turns their head at this point. So the basic idea is that they probably wouldn't be the guys we'd want to see in Damascus, but some elements of the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces are actually Kurdish, and they could be useful in essence, dividing up Syria and installing somewhat pro-U.S. regimes in other parts of Syria. So let's say the scenario moves forward and we have a situation where Assad maintains power in Damascus, but other parts of the country are divided up into different sections. There's every likelihood that there could be a Kurdish section, that there could be Sunni Arab sections. So what the right U.S. policy in this case would be hard to determine, obviously, but one possibility is that we would support the splitting up of Syria in different areas like that. Nobody has said that officially, but that's the kind of thing that this could lead to. And the Syrian Democratic Forces, they are definitely a motley collection of different groups, many of them with terrorist ties, but they're basically two kinds of people in Syria right now. Those who support Assad and who are supported by the Russians, and those who are terrorists. There's almost no middle ground there, and that's what has made the Syrian civil war so dangerous.
And if we choose a middle way, like the enforcement of a de facto no-fly zone, as you suggested, maybe in the offing, does it really advance our flag in that region? I mean, is it the case where we either have to pick, to borrow a line from Homeland, we either turn Raqqa into a parking lot, or we just leave it alone and don't allow ourselves to be pulled into uh, additional conflicts with Russia and Iran by trying to prop up the SDF in Syria?
I think what will happen is we'll definitely go after Raqqa. So I think Raqqa might find itself in some modified form of parking lot in the next few months. And of course they'll try to minimize the damage to civilian structures as much as possible, although that's going to be really, really difficult. What you're going to see also is some kind of a tacit agreement with the Russians, potentially even through back channels with the Iranians, that will allow them a certain sphere of influence in Syria. And the other parts of Syria, I think, are going to be at least de facto split off from that country. So that's the kind of future that I see there, and it's going to be very hard not to get even further involved if you're going to keep something like that going, and preventing them from continuing to fight each other. As we've seen during the Syrian civil war over the past 11 or so years.
I wanted to ask you to move over to London. There's been another ban that plows into pedestrians in London. But this time it was the person who was driving the vehicle got out and said, "You deserve this." Do you consider this a terror attack when it's a reverse situation where you have a 48-year-old white male who rams his van into a crowd of Muslims who are leaving a mosque?
I do, and the reason I consider it a terror attack is because terrorism, by definition, is an attack by a non-state person or actor or organization against civilians. And that's these people, as far as we know, the people that were victims of this were, in fact, as far as we can tell, civilians leaving a place of worship, and that leads you into the area of terrorism. And so, by any other term, I'd say this is a terror act. It is, as things go, a relatively small act, but it's still, a tragedy for those involved. And, regardless of faith and regardless of who the perpetrator is, it does certainly bear all the marks of a terror attack.
I wanted to get your insight on one other matter over the weekend, the ramming of the USS Fitzgerald by a cargo ship and 7 sailors dead. How does a billion-dollar state-of-the-art warship like the USS Fitzgerald not detect a slow-moving cargo ship prior to the impact? Yeah.
Yeah, that's really the big question, and of course, the Navy, the Seventh Fleet out there in Yokosuka, Japan, is starting an investigation, and the admiral that's in charge of that, has basically announced that everything that they're going to be looking at includes, how did this happen, and why on earth would a slow-moving, huge cargo vessel come this close and crash into a destroyer of the type of the USS Fitzgerald. So that really is a major question, because the Fitzgerald is in fact equipped with radar equipment. It's also got collision avoidance systems of various types that are on board the aircraft, on board the vessel. And the big thing there is, I've actually spent some time on board ships similar to the USS Fitzgerald, and the berthing area where the 7 sailors perished. Those berthing areas are really small and narrow, confined spaces. So it would have been almost impossible for them to get out of these areas, and that compounds the tragedy in a case like this. But there are a lot of questions that need to be answered. I think based on preliminary reports, the cargo vessel was initially going in a direction that was similar to that of the Fitzgerald, and then it turned around, according to these reports, quickly for a ship quickly, and moved back in the opposite direction, and that part somehow was missed by the Fitzgerald's crew, I guess. And that, based on these reports, you have to wonder why it was missed and how this could, in fact, have happened. It's one thing for them to turn around. Normally, you have ways of detecting that, and you see that happening. And plus, they're also supposed to communicate, any kind of drastic maneuver like that.
Well, it looked like a sharp U-turn from the cargo ship that was owned by a Filipino company. So I don't.
Right, exactly. And so, from that standpoint, why were they making that sharp U-turn, and why was this done in this way in a fairly busy shipping channel that, was really one of the lifelines of Tokyo? And so that's something that really does not make sense, and I think they need to look at it from a complete perspective. What kinds of things could have happened? Was this some kind of odd rogue action, or was this something that was more routine? It doesn't look like it was routine, but it's certainly something that requires a great deal of investigation and a lot of criminal investigative work.
He is Colonel Cedric Leighton, military intelligence expert who served both on the Joint Chiefs of Staff as well as the National Security Council. Colonel Leighton, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
You bet, Dan. It's always a pleasure.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan and Amy using the AM